Now, today's talk, I want to talk a little bit about social anxiety and social anxiety disorder. As Janet mentioned, one of the things that we do at the Centre for Emotional Health, we deal with anxiety disorders and related problems right across the lifespan, from early childhood right through to older age. But one of the programs that we do run is for social anxiety disorder in adults. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm not going to talk specifically about our program so much. At the end of tonight's talk, I will ask Yalisha to come up and just give you a very quick rundown about the program, and if anyone's interested in getting involved in the program, she'll give you some details about how to actually do that. But what I wanted to do was just really give a bit of a sort of overview of the nature of social anxiety and what it is, where it comes from, and how we go about treating it. And it's really an overview. So for those of you who are in the psychological field, those of you who are colleagues and students, a lot of this will be very familiar to you, and some of it might be a little bit different for some of you. I thought the best way to start, it's always good to make these things real world or personal, so I thought I'd start with a, it's disappeared from my screen, it's disappeared from there as well. I thought I'd start with a case who we'll call John. And I think John was about 50 years of age, as far as I know. From memory was here we go, good. Was a guy who had reported being shy, worried, a sort of a nervous type of child all through his life, as long as he could remember. He remembered being very fearful as a child. His parents talked about the fact, or he'd told him about the fact that he'd avoided school. This is going to be a very long talk, isn't it? I can see I'm going to have to read ahead. Good. He had very few friends and had been victimised in school. When he got a bit older, was a young man, he didn't have very many dates, and the few dates that he had, he described as a bit of a disaster. And so as a result, he tended to have no girlfriends and hadn't become married, had no partner. In his words, he said that he managed to struggle through university and he finished a degree in engineering. With the dean here, I won't make any negative comments about the equipment at Macquarie, but yeah. Anyway, he is from memory, I'm trying to remember now, he finished a degree in engineering. He didn't work in the end as an engineer for very long. His main report when he came to see us was saying that he was terrified about what people thought of him. He said basically that he avoided socialising with anyone, and when he did need to meet people, he would often have a drink just to get through the interaction, whether it was seeing the plumber to fix his home, or whether it was meeting a friend or colleague. He would have a drink or two. He said that he described that he had two people who he would describe as sort of friends. He saw them occasionally, but he said he wasn't close to them. They weren't really people that he would describe as very good friends. He had worked for a little while after leaving university in engineering positions, generally in low-level engineering positions, but he tended to leave most of those jobs. And the reasons he left were either because his social withdrawal and his social anxiety kept him from working very well, and so he would be fired, or sometimes the opposite, that he worked very well and he got to a position where his boss would say, wow, we're going to promote you and you're now going to become a manager of a section, and he would then leave because it was too overwhelming to him, so for both reasons. So when we saw him by the age of 50, he was working as a handyman, and he said even there he was quite unreliable because he would often get so overwhelmed with anxiety when he went to a job that he just wouldn't turn up. He described sometimes just sitting in the car waiting and trying to decide if he would go in or not, and finally just going home. And occasionally the only way he could get to a job was by having a drink or two, and then of course that didn't bode very well when he turned up and people would smell the alcohol. So that's one example of a person with what you might talk about as social anxiety disorder, and what we would call as fairly severe end of social anxiety disorder. To give you an idea of the scope and the range of the sorts of people that we see and the sorts of people we're talking about, another person, this is not working, that we'd call Rena, is someone who had Here we go. It was a 34-year-old woman with 2 young children, aged 7 and 10. She married her first boyfriend, called Costas, when they were 19, when she was 19, and she described the marriage as basically okay. She said it wasn't a fantastic romance, but they were companionable, they got on, and things were going all right. She was a woman, I think, with generally who most people from outside would see as very high functioning, would think that she has no problems at all. She talks about Costa spending a lot of time at work, and gradually the two of them drifting apart as she became closer to her children and he basically got more and more involved in his work. Rena had a degree in accounting, but wasn't currently working because she was staying home with her children. She said essentially Costas has a good job, works well, earns good money, and so life is comfortable for the two of them. They have a nice home, a number of good friends, and no real conflict. So this is a person who you would look at from outside and say, what a great life. Life's good, nice home, nice family. They don't hit each other, they don't get upset, they don't fight. Life's pretty good. She said she's happy to be at home, but she does talk about the fact that she often wonders and fantasises about what it would be like to go back to work. How she'd love to go back, she'd love to get a job back in accounting and start to earn an income herself and be somewhat more independent. She talked about wanting to go travelling, I think, from memory, with some of her female friends, and just talked about the fact that that would be really hard for her, that she just really felt that she didn't have the confidence to do that, to leave, to go off on her own. And we might have some technology. Do we have technology? Oh, that'd be great. She talks about the fact that when they do go out, Costas tends to dominate and tends to do most of the talking. She doesn't talk very much. And she currently talks about how she has generally low self-esteem. She doesn't believe she's a very interesting person. She doesn't believe that she's very capable in doing things. And so would struggle to, she thinks she would struggle to hold down a job, but she's just too scared to have a go. As I mentioned, she's recently been invited on an overseas holiday. So there's a good example of the two sort of extremes, if you like, of what we talk about when we talk about social anxiety disorder. We have one person who's really quite crippled by the problem, is living almost, you describe as a recluse, has adopted additional problems, substance use, has no friendships, and his life is totally overtaken by the problem. At the other end of the extreme, you've got someone who, from all external views, would be seen as a high-functioning, very happy and very well-adjusted. Someone you describe as a high-functioning person, and yet who herself is saying that she's just, life's okay, but she's just not really happy with life, that life could be better. And there are a number of things, if she could build her self-esteem, if she could become more confident, she sees a lot of directions that her life would go and she'd be a lot happier, but life's not terrible. And so they've got those two extremes. And they're both people that we would talk about as having social anxiety disorder, and they're both sorts of people that we would see here in our clinic. Now, these are all different examples of the range of social anxiety disorder. You can see there's quite variable ways in which people with this type of problem present, and we can range from what you might call very normal, very high functioning, to quite extreme withdrawal. So, what's social anxiety disorder? At the core of what we talk about as social anxiety disorder is what people usually refer to as a fear of negative evaluation. So people who are socially anxious tend to talk about these very negative beliefs, all centred around the idea that people will think something badly of me, other people will think badly of me. So there might be thoughts like I'm unattractive, I'm incompetent, they won't like me, I don't belong here, I don't fit in, my talk's going to go badly, the AV equipment will fail, those sorts of beliefs. So that's that, in some way others will evaluate me or think of me negatively. The other core feature is avoidance, and that avoidance can partly be, and it's avoidance of social situations, of course, so following on from a worry about what other people think of me, people will think badly, and because there's a concern people will think badly, therefore you avoid. You don't want to go near those social situations. And so sometimes that avoidance is very overt, that is, it's very obvious, so it can be involving things like meeting new people, going on dates, even things like sitting in hairdressers or going to barbers where there's a mirror. People can sometimes worry about that. Giving talks, putting a hand up and asking questions in a group, being assertive. All those very overt types of social interactions are often avoided by people with social anxiety disorder. There's also a range of what we might talk about as more subtle types of avoidance. So these are things that are often missed. So when we talk to people who are coming to see us in our clinic, and they'll often talk about the overt avoidance. They'll often say, well, I've got a problem because I can't go on dates, or I've got a problem because I can't ask questions in a group. But they often miss the very subtle ways in which this problem can affect their entire life. So it could be things like just generally being the centre of attention. They don't want to get up and walk out of the room because people will look at them, or come into a room once there are people already seated. Or they might avoid eye contact as a way of coping with their social anxiety. And as a result, what you often find is that other people might say, oh, that person's a bit weird. You know, they don't look at me when I talk to them. And they're not weird at all. They're lovely people, but they just have trouble making eye contact. So you get a secondary problem. Or they might speak very quietly in a group. They don't talk very loudly and you can't hear them. And again, people say, oh, as a result, people will often ignore that person. And you find they go along to groups and they mix and they say, oh, I go to groups, I mix with people, but everyone ignores me, no one likes me. And it's not true they don't like them, it's because their avoidance, their subtle avoidance, is such that they're perhaps not saying very much or not talking up or not speaking loudly, and so people just move on. They go on to talk to the louder person. And so they appear not to like them, but it's not true. Or any sort of looking different. They often will say things like, oh, I'd love to have that latest hairstyle, or I'd love to wear that really great shirt or that great tie, but it would draw too much attention to myself. I'm too scared to do that. So a lot of those more subtle types of avoidance behaviours are very common. So I guess one of the questions then that people would say, well, isn't that just shyness? Everyone's like that. People, you know, shyness is normal. And the answer is yes, that's exactly what it is. When we're talking about social anxiety disorder, we're talking about degrees of shyness. And across a population, people vary in how shy they are, right through from at one end, people who are not at all shy, through at the other end to people who are extremely, extremely shy. And that's the students will recognise a nice little normal distribution there. I managed to get that off the internet. It was fantastic. And so the normal distribution basically says that you get very few people who are not very shy, and you get more and more people becoming more shy. You get the majority of people who are averagely or moderately shy, and then you get less and less people who are extremely shy or very much shy. But it varies in degree. And shyness is very normal. There was a very famous survey that people have talked about for many decades now. I remember when I was a student learning about a famous American social psychologist called Philip Zimbardo, who did a survey this very clever survey where he went to a group of university students and said, are you shy? That's the sort of groundbreaking research that psychologists sometimes do. And he found that 40% of them said, yes, I'm shy, tick. So if you ask people that very vague, very broad question, do you see yourself as shy? 40% of the population say, yeah, I'm shy, I'm a shy person. So it's common, it's normal. It's not something, it's not craziness, it's a very normal thing, but it varies in degree and it varies in impact. So the issue is not whether someone is shy or not, but the issue is how does that affect their life. The other thing I just want to make that point is shyness is also important. So it's important to be a little bit shy, because at the bottom end of that continuum, you've got what I've listed as socially inappropriate. And if you were not at all shy, in other words, if you were someone who didn't care at all what other people thought of you, then you'd be very socially inappropriate. You'd pick your nose in public, or you'd wear your underwear on the outside, or I don't know, whatever it might be. You would do things that just don't fit with our society. Shyness is part of the way in which our society keeps people being somewhat similar and keeps people integrated into society. So you need to have some degree of shyness. So you want to be somewhere in the middle. You don't necessarily want to be at the extreme end, but even being at the extreme end is okay if it doesn't impact on your life. And that's what we're trying to do something about. So one of the things that I was intrigued about, first of all, I thought I'd give a little feel-good message here at this point, which is to talk about the idea that shyness can have a lot of positives. And this was a book which was actually on the New York Times bestseller list last year, I think, called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, by Susan Cain. And I became aware of this when a journalist called me, and this book had just come out, and this journalist was very excited about, why are you treating social phobia? Why are you doing anything about social phobia? Can't you see that introversion's a good thing? And I said, yeah, it is. It's a great thing in many cases. We're not saying it's a bad thing. So what Susan Cain says is at least 1/3 of the people we know are introverts. They're the ones who prefer listening to speaking, who innovate and create but dislike self-promotion, who favour working on their own over working in teams. It's to introverts, Rosa Parks, Chopin, Dr. Seuss, Steve Wozniak, that we owe many of the great contributions to society. And that's true. So people who are shy, withdrawn, introverted can be great contributors to society and extremely important, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing to be extroverted, it's a good thing to be introverted. Human diversity is a great thing. We're not concerned about that, and we're not trying to change that. And you shouldn't, or people that you know and yourself shouldn't be trying to change the personality, the basic person who you are. What we want to be asking is the question, does it affect your life? So if you think back to the people I talked about at the beginning of the talk, whatever his name was, John and Rena, they in various ways, in their own individual ways, had life impact. For John, his life was dramatically impacted. He was drinking, he didn't have any friends, he couldn't work in his chosen career. For Rena, she had more subtle impact, but still she said, in her view, her life was impacted. She couldn't get out of her marriage, she couldn't get to do the things she wanted to do in her life, she couldn't get back to work. So it was life impact. It's not the degree of shyness or introversion that's important, it's how much it affects their life that's important. So let's look at the impact of social anxiety. As I've been saying with the illustration, the couple of cases, the impact is variable. It varies from very mild impact through to extreme impact. In many cases, the impact can be quite subtle. So people who are just not very assertive, who find themselves getting pushed around by other people, who find themselves doing things they don't want to do because they're too shy to stand up for themselves and say, no, I don't want to do that. Other people who are very perfectionistic because they're worried about making mistakes because then people will laugh at them or be angry at them. And through to people who have difficulty making friends, who perhaps would have 1 or 2 friends but would like more. So sometimes the impact is subtle. On average, if you look at the research tells us that people with social anxiety disorder do tend to, on average, have fewer friends than the average. They are less likely to be married or have a partner. They tend to be in lower level jobs and are more likely to be unemployed. They're more likely to have social difficulties, so they're more likely to get bullied and teased, more likely to be abused. They're also more likely to be lonely and depressed, and sometimes suicidal, and they're more likely to abuse substances, particularly alcohol. That's on average. There's a whole broad range, and there are many people with social anxiety disorder who don't display those things, who have plenty of friends, who are married, etc., etc. But the average, it does affect people on average in those sorts of ways. It does have, from a societal perspective, across the board, it does have a fairly large impact on people's lives. This is another bit of a feel-good. This was a woman called Shan Pryor. Some of you, Janet, I think, and some of you may know the name Margot Pryor. Margot is a very well-known developmental psychologist from Australia. Well, Shan Pryor is her daughter. Margot's now retired, and Shan is a journalist who herself has described a whole lot of problems with shyness over her life. And I'm not breaking confidentiality by saying that because it's on a public blog. And she's recently written a book from a first-person perspective about being socially anxious and shy. In the book, I was trying to look for it, so it's obviously not out yet, but I think it'll be coming out sometime soon. But I did find her blog, and this is just a really lovely example of what it feels like to have the impact and the sort of impact that social anxiety can have from a first-person perspective. So this is Shan talking in her blog, and she says, I'm standing on the fringes of a room full of strangers, and a familiar sensation is seeping through my body. It's as if someone has snuck up behind me and spiked my drink, so that instead of a glass of mineral water, I'm now sipping a kind of sparkling liquid concrete. My limbs are growing rigid, my neck is seizing up, and my smile is turning into one of those insane grins on the faces of young ballet dancers whose pointe shoes are actually killing them. It's 7:45 on a Saturday night in winter. My fellas football team won by 26 points. He's had a couple of beers and a whiskey somewhere between the MCG and the birthday party, and now I can't find him in the crowd. I'm over 40 but feeling about 14, and I'm sidling towards the door. The car needs to be moved, I tell myself. An hour won't be long enough. There must be a better park somewhere close by, or far away, at home perhaps. Anyway, I'll just go and move it, shall I? My movements have suddenly become as fluid as a cat after a bird. Putting down my glass of fizzy concrete, I take 3 steps and I'm out the door and free and moving fast now. So fast it must look suspicious. But I can see the car and I'm pressing the blue button on the key ring and the headlights are flashing and I've got hold of the handle and now I'm inside the car and alone and safe. If it wasn't so ridiculous, I'd be laughing out loud. What's a polite, nearly middle-aged woman like me doing leaving a party without even saying goodbye to her fella, let alone to the birthday girl? Regressing, that's what. Behaving like she used to before she became a confident career woman, like she did in the bad old days when she was a shy young thing. So I liked that because I thought it was a really nice description from a person's perspective of just the impact on life and what it feels like and how disappointing and devastating it is for her to realise what she's done, to have walked out and then be thinking, what am I doing? I'm an idiot. Why am I doing that? And that then adds to that life impact. It's not only the impact on her life in a concrete fashion, that is because she's left a party and she hasn't mixed with people and made friends, but the impact on her psychology, on her emotions, by the loss of self-esteem, the negative self-statements, the view that, oh, I'm so incompetent, I'm so hopeless, how could I be 40 years old and leaving a party and so on. So it's a very nice, I think, description of that. If anyone wants to look that up, if you look up Shan Pryor, you can find her blog, and she's got a whole long description there. So let's have a little look at some of where all this comes from. So the question is, why am I socially anxious? Where does some of this come from? What I'm talking about here is I'm going to talk about the factors that we think are important in social anxiety, some of the key factors that are important in keeping social anxiety going. What makes someone keep on being socially anxious? I'm not going to talk about where it comes from, as in, you know, the horrible things your parents did to you and things like that. That's another talk. So one of the issues is negative beliefs. We know that people with social anxiety disorder tend to make 2 big overestimations. They overestimate how likely it is that something socially bad will happen. That is, that people will laugh at me. People will, I'll make a mistake. I'll say something stupid. I'll trip over the rug as I'm walking out the door. They think it's very, very likely those things will happen, whereas in fact it's probably not very likely. So they overestimate how likely it is that bad things will happen. And secondly, they overestimate how bad it'll be. So they think, when I'm walking out of the room here, I'm going to trip over the doorway or something like that. That's an overestimate of something bad happening. And secondly, that when I do that, everyone in the room will notice and they'll all laugh at me and they'll all talk about me afterwards. That's an overestimate of the consequence, of how bad it is. Neither of those things are probably very true. So to give you an example, so imagine a little scenario. Imagine that you're walking down the street and you see someone that you know. As you're walking towards them, you raise your hand, and then just as you're about to say hello, you notice that they didn't actually notice you, and they walked past and they didn't say hello. So you might ask yourself 2 questions. First of all, how likely is it that that would happen to you, say tomorrow? And secondly, if it happened, how bad would that be? So here's an example of some research by a very well-known American researcher, Edna Foer, and her colleagues back in 1996, looking at the answers to that sort of question. And so looking at probability and cost, probability that that bad thing would happen, and the cost, if it did happen, how bad would it be, and comparing people with social anxiety disorder and community controls. And you can see that in general, people with social anxiety disorder are much more likely to say, yep, someone will walk past me and ignore me, or things along those lines. Bad social things will happen. And secondly, if they happen, that would be an absolute tragedy. That would be really, really bad. So we know that's the case, and there's lots and lots of studies like that. Second thing that people with social anxiety disorder do is that when those things happen, or when they think those things happen, they then will go home after that. So let's go back to our scenario, and let's assume that happened to you, that you're walking down the street, you lifted your hand, about to say hello, and the person kept on walking and didn't say anything. A person with social anxiety disorder will go home and then will lie awake at night thinking, why didn't that person say hello? They must really hate me. That was a really stupid thing. Maybe I didn't make myself known enough. Maybe I did something really dumb. Maybe I'm really insignificant. And they have all these thoughts running through their heads, negative thoughts, regurgitating that whole scenario and that whole idea and making it worse and worse and worse and getting into a spiral. People without social anxiety disorder just go to sleep. They don't think about it. So there's a difference in the estimates of how bad these things are But secondly, there's an overestimate or an over-tendency to then go through these things and regurgitate them and make them worse and worse. We had some lovely data on that. One of my students from many years ago, Susan Edwards, who some people may still remember, who's now working in private practice in the Manly area, I think, somewhere out there, Balgowlah. She did a study where she got people, in this case it wasn't clinical people, but it was people from first-year psychology. We love our first-year students as our little guinea pigs, and they do lots and lots of our research for us. And she selected the first-year students who were very high in social anxiety, very shy, withdrawn, socially anxious students, and very confident, outgoing students. And she got them to come in and she got them all to give a speech. As you can imagine, the socially anxious people loved that little bit part of the study. And we said, okay, we're going to get you to give a 2-minute or three-minute impromptu speech. They did that, and at the end of the speech, she then sat down with them and she gave them some set feedback. And the feedback was actually scripted. It wasn't real. She tried to sort of match it to the person and make it a bit believable, but basically it was scripted, so that she had a number of elements in the feedback that were negative. Things like, well, you know, your eye contact wasn't very good and you didn't speak very clearly and your topic was a bit waffly, and a number of elements that were positive. You had a great, you know, voice tone and you kept me engaged, and I love that little joke you made in the middle or something like that. So both positive and negative things. She then sent them away and she got them back to come back again a week later. And so a week later when they came back, she had the questionnaire asking them basically, how much did you think about these things? How much over the past week did you think about the feedback I gave you? And of course she'd given them positive and negative, so she could see whether they thought about the positive or negative feedback. And what she found was exactly what you'd expect. No difference in the positive. Both the high anxious and the low anxious people thought about the positive feedback equally, but the highly anxious people thought much more about the negative feedback. The low anxious people said, I didn't think much about that. So you said I did a couple of things wrong, no big deal. The high anxious people kept dwelling about it and kept thinking about, oh, she said my voice tone wasn't good, or she said my topic was boring. Oh, why'd she say that? And they worried about it. The second thing she did, so that's a sort of a subjective measure, a slightly more objective measure, was the second thing she did was she gave them a test a week later, where she showed them a whole lot of mix of different types of feedback and said, which of these bits of feedback did I tell you last week, to test the accuracy of their memory? How good were they at remembering the feedback? And what she found was the socially anxious people were actually genuinely better at remembering the negative feedback. So it's not some sort of psychological fake thing that they're doing. They are genuinely going through this stuff and they are reinforcing their memory for negative events. So a socially anxious person then is bringing back all this negative material and is remembering it very, very well. So what happens the next time a person with social anxiety disorder then goes to give a speech? Well, they remember all this stuff. They remember it very accurately. Oh, gee, you know, last time I gave that talk, 3 people in the audience fell asleep. I remember that. And so then they're much more likely to be anxious. The low anxious person doesn't remember that stuff as well. So even if 3 people did go to sleep in their audience, they've forgotten it the next time they give a speech. So there's a very important difference of what's going on psychologically. I'm running out of time already. Okay. I'll try and speed up a bit. Why am I socially anxious? Second issue is that people with social anxiety sort of pay more attention to negative information. They focus on it, and therefore, again, it buys in, they remember it more and they think about it more. So people with social anxiety just sort of think much more about, pay more attention to how awkward they look, how different they look in groups, etc., and also about the negative feedback from other people. So they're paying a lot of attention to themselves, how sort of weird, how blushed I am, how sweating I am, whatever. And they're paying a lot of attention to all the people in the audience, especially the negatives in the audience. So this is a lovely little study, and so you can see the guy on the right there, who we all know is a very shy, retiring butterfly. This is a study that one of my students did a number of years ago, Kathy Veljaka, and it's a lovely study where what she did was she got people to give a speech. Once again, she got high and low socially anxious people. She asked them to give a 3-minute speech. And what she did was she got them to hold a button in their hands, one in each hand, left hand, right hand, which I've sort of tried to indicate there. And basically, she got an audience, a real audience, and she trained them. She got friends of hers and she trained them up so that while the people were giving a talk, the people in the audience, once again, were giving scripted feedback. So various times throughout the talk, people might give negative feedback, like they might yawn, or they might look away out the window, or they might look sort of puzzled or annoyed, or they gave positive feedback, nodding, smiling, leaning forward, something like that. So you had both positive and negative feedback. And what they did was they were told, give the speech. While you're giving the speech, you may or may not notice positives and negatives in the audience. Every time you notice something positive, push the left button. Every time you notice something negative, push the right button. And so they simply had to give the speech, at the same time had to look for positives and negatives and indicate. And what you found was that the people who were high in social anxiety were actually better at identifying the real negative behaviours. This is not, again, not a psychological faking thing. It's not a bias. This is real. They are detecting the negatives much better than people who are low in social anxiety. Whereas the opposite is true for positives. People who are low in social anxiety, much better at picking up the positives than people who are high. So people who are low in social anxiety, they come and they give a talk, they're looking for all the people who are nodding and smiling and agreeing with them. Anyone who's yawning, they're ignoring them. Someone who's socially anxious, on the other hand, anyone who's yawning or falling asleep, they're looking for them. So what do you think that does to the person at the end? You think of a high socially anxious and a low socially anxious person giving a speech and then leaving the room. What are they thinking about afterwards? The high socially anxious person has only noticed the people who are yawning. They're going away thinking, oh, that was an awful speech. Everyone was yawning. So that's really important information about the type of mental processes that are going on that are keeping this whole problem going. And finally, we know that people with social anxiety disorder have a very negative view of themselves, a falsely negative view of themselves. So they have an overly negative perception. And we know it's false from the research we've done. So some of the research we've done here, and there's been a number of these, so I've got a slide which sort of puts some of this information together. But the type of research we've done in the past is things like we ask people with social anxiety disorder and non-clinical people to come into our clinic. We ask them to give a speech. And when they give the speech, we get independent raters who don't know who they are, they don't know who's anxious, who's not anxious. They watch them and they score them for their speech quality, to score how good their speech is. So they say, yeah, they were great. They gave, a very interesting topic and very good voice tone. Oh, their eye contact wasn't perfect, etc. And they give them a score. We give exactly the same measure, questionnaire measure, to the person themselves. And we say to the person, tell us how you score yourself. So the person gives a speech, they score themselves, and an independent rater scores the same person. So we can then look at the difference score. We can look at how well that person's own view of themselves matches up to how the independent rater saw them. And we can get a difference. If you get a negative score, that means that you are seeing yourself as worse than the independent rater sees you. If you get a positive score, that means you're pretty full of yourself and you think that you're better than people actually think you are. We also have done the same thing with attractiveness, just to give it a different perspective. So I've asked people, please tell us, how attractive do you think you are? And we give them, again, a measure on a number of scales. How attractive is your face? How attractive is your body? How attractive is your hair, etc. And we get them to rate, again, their scoring. It's hard for people to do that. And then again, we get independent raters to look at them and rate and score them. How attractive is this person? And once again, the same thing. We can look at, if they've got a negative score, that means they think that they're uglier than other people see themselves as being. When we look at that, we find exactly what you'd expect. People with social anxiety disorder rate their speech performance as considerably worse relative to independent raters than people without social anxiety disorder. And attractiveness, the same thing. They rate themselves as considerably less attractive relative to an independent person. Relative to objective, they see themselves as objectively worse compared to people without social anxiety disorder. So again, so there we have a different sort of mental problem, mental issue, that is that it's a bias in the perception. They perceive themselves as being unattractive, incompetent, poor performing, etc. And it's not true. So, can we put that together to treat social anxiety disorder? Can we develop treatments? And the answer is yes, we can. I've already mentioned that we have a program here that we've been running. And the aim, based on what I was saying earlier on in the talk, the aim is really to help people develop skills to reduce the impact on their life, to reduce life interference. We're not trying to change people's basic shyness. We are a little bit, but essentially personality is personality. We don't get much of a change in basic shyness. what we're getting a change in is the way in which they're interacting with the world, and therefore the interference in life, the impact on a person's life. And that's what we're trying to improve. And it works, and it works well. So here's an example of what we do at the moment in our clinic. This is our current program. We currently run the program in small groups, groups of people who all have social anxiety disorder, so it's always a little bit difficult to turn up at the beginning, but people do start to relax after time, and they start to form quite nice bonds together. And we go through these these sorts of components. So we teach people a bit about social anxiety, the sort of thing that I've been giving you the talk about today. We teach people more realistic ways of thinking. So in other words, getting them to start to not focus attention onto all the negatives, teaching them to think more realistically about the probability of and the consequences of negative events. How likely is it that bad things will happen? How bad would it be? We teach them to shift their attention. Stop paying attention to all the people who are yawning and frowning in the audience. Shift your attention to what you're doing. Leave them, ignore them, they're unimportant. Think about what you're doing so you're doing a better job. We teach people more realistic life scripts. We teach people about their view of themselves across life. What sort of person were you growing up, and how can we change that general view of yourself, in a sense, to build up self-confidence. A key issue is we get people to very, very gradually and very systematically start to face their fears. People who say, I don't like going on dates, we start to get them to go on dates, but they do it in a very, very small steps, very gradual way, so that it's not difficult. So they find it easy, and they start to build up confidence in doing that. We reduce subtle avoidance as well. We also give a lot of feedback. So the sorts of things that I was saying about attractiveness, that people see themselves as being particularly unattractive, for example. We start to try and work out ways of getting realistic feedback, so they realise, well, actually, what I think is not really what other people think, to get realistic feedback from the world. And then we start to build also specific skills, helping people develop assertiveness, building trust, more trust and confidence, dealing with teasing, bullying, those sorts of issues. So trying to get people to build specific social sorts of interaction skills. So the question is, does that work? And so here's some results from one of our big studies that we did a couple of years ago. This is comparing 3 different versions or 3 different types of treatment. And this is looking at, the light blue is what people's scores, the degree of interference in people's lives before treatment, and the degree to which their problems interfered with their life after treatment. And you can see that after treatment, everyone basically said that my life is better than it was before. But what we find is that in the CEH program, the program in our clinic, when we compared our program with other programs, that our program actually was slightly better. And so we're actually getting better effects in the program that we run than in some of the more traditional types of programs that are run. And that's in terms of that life impact, life interference. So let me finish up with a nice positive, hopefully, once again from Sian Pryor, from her blog. And she says, according to a website called shakeyourshyness.com, Abraham Lincoln, Albert Einstein and Ella Fitzgerald were all painfully shy, but it hasn't prevented them from becoming household names. In fact, no less than 80 immortals were outed on this website as the kind of people who'd probably scuttle away from parties with the least provocation. So the take-home message is that being shy, being withdrawn, being an introvert should not stop people from reaching all sorts of potentials, from changing the world, as people did. It's about the life impact, and we do have some very good procedures and some very good strategies to help change that degree of life interference. So, thanks. Now, I'm just wondering, people might have a few questions, and I'm also just wondering when Yuli might... Yeah, you want to... Maybe it'd be good to flow on now, and then there might be questions afterwards. So, yeah, do you want to jump up? So, Ulisha Biro is one of our wonderful research assistants and therapists. You're a therapist as well? No? No? Okay, one of our PhD students and researchers at the centre, and she runs the social phobia program, and will tell you a bit about the program.
Fantastic. That's my whole first paragraph right there, my introduction. All right, so I just wanted to have a quick chat to you guys about a couple of the things that we have going on at the clinic. Firstly, our program. We're running our adult social anxiety group treatment program. So Ron's gone over a bit about what we sort of cover in terms of the treatment itself. It's an evidence-based CBT program where our therapists basically teach our clients skills to help them manage their anxiety. The program's actually been developed through our research unit over, say, the last 10 years or so, something like that. And it really does have some really innovative treatment techniques. So in terms of structure, there are 3 individual preparatory sessions that we have before our clients go into group. So these are all one-on-one. And then there are 12 group sessions, which run over 12 weeks. So that's 15 sessions altogether. In terms of, I guess, cost of the program is $300 for all 15 sessions. However, if you're, a full-time student or receiving Centrelink benefits or unemployed, we do offer a reduced fee, and that's $200 for the entire group. All our clients as well, because we're a research treatment trial, we have some follow-up sorts of interviews and things, and if you attend those, they're refunded $100. So it really is quite good. I guess to be eligible for the program, you have to be over 18. And if you have any other questions or you want to contact me or the clinic, we've handed out this little flyer. It's all about our treatment program and has our contact details, and pretty much anything you'd really need to know about it is in here. The other thing I wanted to chat to you about is this great resource we have. It's a book. It's called Overcoming Shyness and Social Phobia. It's written by Ron. It's written for adults suffering from social anxiety, and it really it describes a really clear sort of treatment in steps. So it's quite practical. It's a step-by-step guide, and it's been designed to help control social fears and build inner confidence. So that's great too. What I did really, really like about the book, though, is that the practicality of it. It's got some great exercises and thought records and things that you can actually do as well. And that's available from our web shop. The cost is $23.95, I've been told. And for details about the web address and that sort of thing, inside this little booklet here, inside the little flyer, is a little slip, and it's got the web address on there, so you can purchase the book online. Okay? That's it. Ron, you wanted to do some questions? Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Lily. That's great. Yeah, if there's any questions, I was going to also I was asked to put that up, that if in case anyone wants to contact or find out more about the centre, we do have Facebooks and Twitters and things like that, that stuff that young people use. Any questions? Yeah. Well, I guess 2 parts to that question. If there's a demographic or age group that we work with specifically, then no. We actually, at the centre, we work with, we have programs right through from people from preschool age through to older age. So one of our more recent programs is for older adults with mixed anxiety and depression who are sort of aged from, I think it's 60 and up? Yeah, 60 and up. I keep balking on that because 60 seems very young from where I'm standing. But 60 and up, whereas we've also got a preschool program for kids for parents of children who are 3, 4. So we work right across the age span. If you're talking about social anxiety in particular, the general demographic, again, social anxiety can occur at any age. So we get kids 3, 4 years of age who are shy, terrified, timid, won't go to preschool, etc. And you would say, okay, it's social anxiety, it's affecting their life. Now, when you get to that sort of age, preschool age, it's always a little iffy, I think, to be saying they have a disorder, and there's some political controversy in that. But the fact is, it's affecting their life, and we can actually help them, or help their parents to help them in such a way that they actually prevents them having problems down the track. But you do tend to find slight increases, and you get a sort of peak onset of social anxiety disorder around about early to mid-teenage, which of course is the time, that makes sense, that's the time when social stuff is most important to all of us. So that's when it becomes worst. And then it continues on throughout life. you tend to find that social anxiety does decrease a little bit in older age. So after about middle adulthood, you do tend to get drops a little bit. Yeah.
My question is, how would you be able to convince somebody who has got social anxiety problems?
Very hard, very hard. What you're alluding to is, by definition, someone who's very socially anxious, doesn't want to come and see people for help, doesn't want to go join a group especially. It's really about, there's no magic answer, and people are not going to change very much unless they're ready to make some effort. Learning the skills and strategies that we teach does take work, and so people have to be invested and have to want to do it. It doesn't magically come. But you can do things like talking to them about the reasons for change, talking to them about things like how would life be different if they changed. So talking about what would you like different in your life? Would you like to, like the cases we talked about at the beginning of today's talk, would you like to have a job? Would you like to have a partner? Would you like to have more friends? And this is a way in which you can get that. So giving people that sort of incentive about how life could be different can often be one way to say, okay, I know it's really hard, it's a really tough first step to make that move to come in, but think of the great outcome you'll have if you push yourself through that first step. They can also sometimes be willing to do some small steps along the way, like they might just be willing to even give a phone call to one of our therapists, and even just talking to a person at the end of the line, that might help break down that worry, and they might think, okay, well, I've spoken to someone, they sound nice enough, maybe I can do the next step of just going to meet them just for 5 minutes, and then they might go a bit further, etc. So there are ways of maybe breaking it down, but it is very tough.
Yeah, actually, I wanted her to come to this session, but she said, oh, she has got a tab and all these other...
Yeah, yeah. And there's always excuses, yeah.
We have booked 3 of us together for the next session, so I don't know if she will come, but...
Okay, well, hopefully. Yeah, hopefully.
Thank you.
Pleasure. All right. Oh.
Asperger's, and I just wanted to know, that is another social program, isn't it? But
Asperger's is actually a very different sort of problem. So it's more a developmental type of problem. Now, Asperger's will often be linked with social anxiety. So people who have Asperger's or autism, people who have autism types or related problems, part of their condition is that they often are quite socially withdrawn as well. And as a result of that, will often have a lot of social anxieties and social fears as well. So the two can go together, but they're not the same thing. They're two separate things. Now, interestingly, what we actually do have a program for children who have anxiety and Asperger's at the same time. And what the interesting thing is that we can treat the anxiety, and their anxiety goes down, but their Asperger's stays the same. So they are quite separate things, but you can actually successfully treat the anxiety. All right. I think everyone wants to go home and have something to eat. All right, well, hopefully we'll get... you've learned a bit about social anxiety and about the centre, and if you want more information, there's our... well, not there, but somewhere around there, there's our website. Feel free to have a look.